Hello, everyone, and welcome in to another episode of the RTI Podcast. I am Nathaniel Rutherford, the managing editor of RockyTopInsider.com, and I am joined by Ben McKee, our staff writer at RTI. He's also the co-host and, well, he had been the producer of the Swain event, but now that has been gone to Swain's wife because they're, of course, social distancing. But still, Ben McKee here to join me. It's been a while since we've done a regular RTI podcast. There hasn't been a ton of just kind of regular news for Ben and I to talk about. It's been a lot of recruiting stuff, so that's why we've done a ton of the recruiting podcasts. So, Ben, you and I are back here because the recruiting has kind of slowed down a little bit for Tennessee, and there actually is some stuff that I think is worth talking about here. Obviously no, on-field news necessarily. We do have Tennessee and all SEC schools are going to be welcoming back student athletes, on June 8th. So that is some good news, and hopefully, steps in the right direction to have potentially a full and safe season this year in the fall for football across the country. I hope so. We're seeing some other leagues in across the country take steps to try to resume seasons, whether it's the NHL or the NBA. I don't want to talk about the MLB right now. They're irritating me, but we're seeing some positive steps hopefully to have sports come back a little bit and hopefully have a chance to have them in the fall. One thing that I want to talk with you, Ben, and we were kind of asked this in our mailbag this week, but this is something that I think you and I have kind of talked about before in different articles. I know you and Swain have talked about it a little bit, but I wanted to talk kind of a little more specifically about it here. Does all this, the pandemic that's going on with Tennessee only getting 2 spring practices, and most of the country either getting just a handful or no spring practices in football this year, does that actually benefit Tennessee more than it does? I guess you look at their big 4 on the schedule: Alabama, Georgia, Oklahoma, and Florida. Does Tennessee have an advantage over those schools? Because when you look at what Tennessee's roster and coaching staff, how they're constructed heading into this offseason, Tennessee isn't, they're not trying to break in a new offensive coordinator. They're not trying to break in a new defensive coordinator. They're not trying to break in a new head coach. You could argue that, they were trying to break in a new quarterback potentially with Harrison Bailey, but they do have, Jarrett Garantano, who's one of the most experienced returning quarterbacks in the SEC. You have a very experienced offensive line. You have a very experienced defensive line. You have, some holes to fill the wide receiver position, but still some, talent there at least. A pretty experienced running back group as well. Defensively, you have, thin depth at linebacker, which you like kind of what you have there, and you have a really good secondary. I look at what Tennessee has, and I look at the question marks of Oklahoma. Yes, Georgia has talent, but they hired a new offensive coordinator and replaced, I think you pointed out in an article, Ben, 11 starters, or I think it might have been someone else, but they pointed out they have 11 different guys they're trying to replace on offense. Alabama's got new quarterbacks they're going to try to have to figure out this year. Florida does, I think they're maybe the more stable of those group of 4, but they still have plenty they're trying to replace from last season as well. They do have Kyle Trask returning at least, though. But do you think this pandemic, we've seen Tennessee take advantage of the new rules and kind of the new normal in recruiting? Do you think it also gives Tennessee an advantage in on the field this season, whether it's going to be when they play Oklahoma, whether it's they're playing Florida? Do you think Tennessee has an advantage because of all the returning guys they're bringing in, and the fact that they don't have this isn't last off season, they're not having to break in new coordinators for the team this year?
Yeah, I absolutely believe that this quarantine, and as a result of the quarantine, the stoppage of spring practice and schools being unable to go through a typical off-season strength and conditioning program in the summer, they were able to get in their winter strength and conditioning program leading up to spring practice, but the one that typically takes place in the summer, it gives Tennessee an absolute advantage in at least 3 of those 4 big games. I don't think it gives Tennessee an advantage over Alabama because you look at Alabama, and yes, they lose some key pieces. Obviously, Tua Tagovailoa is gone, but Mac Jones is a redshirt junior. It's not ideal for him to not go through all of these practices, as he is now the full-time starting quarterback, because that is a different role entering an off-season. You have different responsibilities, and it's just a different weight on your shoulders, so that is different. But this will be his 4th year in the Alabama football program. I mean, he should be perfectly fine, and other than 2 horrible interceptions he threw against Auburn, he played well last year when he played for an injured Tua, and they have a strong running back group coming back led by Najee Harris, and senior Brian Robinson. You look at the receivers, and sure, they lose Jerry Jeudy and Henry Ruggs, but they're not really going to miss much on the field with Devontae Smith returning for his senior year and Jalen Waddle back for his junior season. Tight end's kind of a weak point for Alabama. You look at the offensive line. Cole Kublik thinks that they're the best offensive line in the SEC, and defense is where it hurts Alabama because they are welcoming back some players who were injured last season. So this offseason would have been critical for them to kind of knock off that rust. But it's still Alabama, and they have plenty of talent in their front seven, and they have future NFL draft picks in their secondary. So I don't think Tennessee has an advantage over Alabama because even though Alabama lost key pieces, they are still a veteran-laden team, whereas Georgia and Oklahoma are the two teams that I really look at as Tennessee having a distinct advantage over due to everything going on. Georgia just replaces so much. Their defense is going to be lights out. There's no questioning Georgia's defense. It has a ton of talent. It has a ton of depth. Kirby Smart, say what you will about him as a head coach, what he has done with the quarterback room, you can't knock his ability to coach up a defense. You know the defense is going to be ready to play. But the offense, it replaces its quarterback, its starting quarterback in Jake Fromm. It loses its top two tailbacks in DeAndre Swift and Brian Harrion. It loses 4 starting offensive linemen in Cade Mays, Andrew Thomas, Isaiah Wilson, Solomon Kinley, and then their second and fifth leading receivers, Lawrence Cager and Tyler Simmons. Those 2 are gone. And then their top 2 tight ends in Charlie Werner and Eli Wolf. Those 2 are gone. So ideally, Tennessee would play Georgia in its typical slot, that last weekend of September, that first weekend of October. But obviously this is the first year in which Georgia and Missouri have been flip-flopped on Tennessee's schedule. So maybe this won't matter by the time Tennessee and Georgia plays, because by the end of the season, Georgia theoretically would be clicking on offense because it does have talent on offense. It's just a bunch of inexperienced talent, a bunch of puzzle pieces needing to come together, and we'll see if new offensive coordinator Ted Monken is able to do that. So right now I do think Tennessee has an advantage over Georgia, but that may dissipate just because Georgia will have plenty of games before they play Tennessee to kind of gel together. I think the big one is Oklahoma, and I've written this and I've said this on the Swain event over the last week or so. I've really talked myself into. I've been on the page that Tennessee is at minimum an 8-4 team, but I truly think over the last week or so I've talked myself into Tennessee beating Oklahoma. I'm not ready to write it in pen. I've written it in pencil so far, and I have my eraser right next to me. But I am leaning towards possibly picking Tennessee in that football game because you look at all the details, and we talked about it on the Friday morning edition of the Swain event. The stadium atmosphere is not going to be what it typically is. Even if fans are allowed in the stadium, Oklahoma Stadium is not going to be at full capacity. It's not going to be as daunting of a road trip as it is going to appear. Oklahoma will have a first-time starting quarterback in Spencer Rattler, and I kind of didn't put a lot of weight on Mac Jones being a first-time starting quarterback at Alabama, but the two are totally different. This is Mac Jones' 4th year in the program at Alabama. This is Spencer Rattler's 2nd year in the program at Oklahoma. So I do think that is a distinct difference, although he is familiar with the playbook and what have you. But he still has to go through a weird offseason as his first time as the starting quarterback, on top of losing CeeDee Lamb and Jaden Hazelwood to a torn ACL. They do have all 5 of their starting linemen back, so that will help. But they're replacing key pieces on the offensive side of the ball, and then on the defensive side of the ball, they are replacing key pieces as well. And Neville Gallimore, the nose guard, Kenneth Murray, who was a first-round pick at linebacker, and Parnell Motley, a corner, who is in the NFL now. So Oklahoma is replacing a ton, on top of not having practice in the spring, a typical summer, and Tennessee is set to return to school June 8th. Oklahoma, it's looking like they're not going to return to campus until the beginning of July. So it's not a huge advantage, but it is most definitely an advantage. So, and the thing that sticks out to me, the difference between what Oklahoma and Georgia kind of Oklahoma being more of an advantage is because Tennessee plays Oklahoma at the beginning of the year, whereas, as I just talked about with Georgia, that's at the end of the year. Georgia will have plenty of time to adapt by the time they play Tennessee. And then Florida, I'm kind of in the middle. I think Tennessee has an ultimate advantage over Oklahoma. I think they have a pretty good advantage over Georgia. Alabama, I don't think they have an advantage. And then I'm somewhere in the middle with Florida. I do think Tennessee has an advantage over Florida, but I don't think it's, an advantage that is going to dictate who wins the football game like it appears it may do so with the Tennessee-Oklahoma game, because I do believe Kyle Trask is the best returning quarterback in the SEC. He has weapons at receiver in Kadarius Toney and Trevon Grimes, and they'll have a running back in Dameon Pierce, even though they lose to Michael Pirine. Their offensive line is a concern, but they also have the best tight end in the SEC as well. So they have plenty of weapons on offense, and on defense they do have to replace some key players, but Florida is always going to be stout on defense regardless. They always have pass rushers that are kind of have not been talked about early in their career, but then manage to break out as a junior or senior and then go on to be a first-round pick. And same can be said for their secondary. So Florida is going to be a strong football team. I wrote this in the mailbag as well. I think as of the end of May, I think they are the SEC East favorites, at least in my mind. They are my current pick to win the SEC East. So I think it's an advantage over Florida. I just don't think it's a distinct advantage over Florida, just because Florida still does have a lot of talent, and they don't have as many question marks as a Georgia or an Oklahoma.
Well, you kind of answered the next question I was going to ask there, so I'm going to kind of reframe it a little bit. But I think I do agree with you there about pretty much everything you just said. I do think Tennessee has an advantage over Oklahoma. I think Tennessee has an advantage over Georgia, and I think they're about even with Florida. Maybe Florida returns enough to where maybe they're still a little bit ahead, but I don't think there's really a noticeable advantage over the Gators. And I do think I don't think there's an advantage at all with Alabama. We were asked in the mailbag this week. Trying to find the name of the person. It was who asked this question. It was Samuel, who said, "What is more likely, Tennessee beating Oklahoma or Tennessee beating Florida?" You kind of went ahead and answered that, for me there, Ben. We obviously answered that in the mailbag. We both went with Oklahoma because we feel like, for one, they're going to have a new starting quarterback, as you just laid out. It's going to be, on the road, Oklahoma. But if this season goes as the way we're thinking it's going to go, as the way a lot of projections are saying, I don't think, Norman, I don't think any stadium this year, Neyland Stadium, any stadium Tennessee plays in is going to be anywhere close to full capacity. If there's fans at all. So, that's not going to be the home advantage for Oklahoma that originally you'd think there would be. You're going to have Spencer Rattler, who definitely has a high ceiling and is a very talented quarterback, but he's going to be making his first start against a Power 5 team, because before that, I'm struggling to remember who they play, but they play just like Tennessee. Tennessee plays Charlotte, and then they play Oklahoma, and Oklahoma plays some, small school, and then they play Tennessee. So that's going to be his first big start against a Tennessee defense that should be pretty good this year. Should be, probably the best defense Tennessee's had under Pruitt to this point. So I'm not going to ask that question, but I think we've covered that pretty well. But I am curious, Ben, on a couple other things that have to do with Tennessee pulling off upsets, because we saw, I can't remember who it was now. I think it might have been Tom Fornelli of CBS Sports potentially, but there was someone, I believe on CBS or 247, in the past week or so, that made a very bold prediction talking about what kind of big major upsets could potentially happen this year in college football, and they picked Tennessee, saying that Tennessee, this could be the year Tennessee upsets Alabama. I'm not buying into that, and I'm also not. We were asked about Oklahoma or Florida. We both picked Oklahoma. I'm not buying into Tennessee beating Florida, but I am very curious on your thoughts on this. If you had to put a percentage or a confidence value or anything like that, however you want to word it, on your opinion on Tennessee's chances of being able to upset Alabama or Florida. I mean, either one. I don't think they're particularly high for either school, but I also don't think you'd be crazy to argue that it could happen, because, well, I think there are a lot of reasons. I want to hear your answer first, then I'll build upon it, lay out my reasons. But what do you think are the chances of Tennessee being able to not upset both, but upset either Alabama or Florida in the 2020 season?
I don't think the chances are great, but there is definitely a chance, which, although that may sound negative, I think Tennessee fans should be excited about that because last year Tennessee didn't have a chance to beat Alabama. Maybe there was a small chance to beat Florida, but based off how the game played out, maybe they didn't have as big of a chance as we thought that they did, even though it was small to begin with. So I think the chances of beating Alabama are still very slim because Alabama just has more talent. They have more depth. You know, I have questions about Tennessee's depth along the defensive line, and I like Aubrey Solomon. I like Emmett Gooden. They have productive players, but do they have game-changing players in Tennessee's front seven that can get after the quarterback? Henry To'o is a game-changing player on the defensive side of the ball in that front seven, but we know he's not going to be asked to get after the quarterback time after time, play after play. Like, who is going to be that Darrell Taylor for Tennessee in that game? I have questions there, and because of that question, you kind of look on the other side, and led by Alex Leatherwood and Landon Dickerson and some other guys, Alabama, again, I mentioned it earlier, Cole Kublik has the best offensive line in the SEC. So, and if they're not the best, then they're the second or third best. So my point in mentioning those other kind of facets is that we know Alabama's offensive line is going to be very good, and Alabama is going to have very talented, skilled players in Devontae Smith and in Jalen Waddle and Najee Harris at the tight end position. And Mac Jones doesn't have to play perfect football in order for Alabama to win. So now their defensive question marks kind of make that game more intriguing because they do have quite a bit of players coming back from injury. DJ Dale is their nose guard. He sustained a knee injury at the end of the year, kind of cost him the rest of his freshman season, but he was very productive. Will he regain the form that he was in before his injury? LeBron Ray, a defensive end who Tennessee recruited coming out of James Clemens High School in Huntsville, Alabama. He's coming off of a serious foot injury that derailed his 2019 season. You have Dylan Moses, who missed last season due to a torn ACL, their heart and soul of the defense at middle linebacker. You also had Josh McMillan tear his ACL. He missed the season last year. He was a crucial edge rusher for the Crimson Tide, and they lose key pieces of their secondary. In fact, they lose 4 of their 5 starters in their nickel defense. They're all on NFL rosters now, so there are question marks on Alabama's defense that maybe Tennessee can take advantage of. Who knows? Maybe Jarrett Garantano plays the game of his life, and Tennessee's offensive line goes to town on an Alabama front seven that has question marks. So Tennessee does have a chance. I just don't know that those chances are great. If I had to put a percentage on it, I don't like doing this because it's hard for me to gauge kind of what an appropriate range of percentage is for these type of games. But with it being in Neyland, I mean, I think it's a 25-30% chance, which to me is a huge upgrade from where it was last year. So I say all that to say Tennessee has a chance. I just don't think it's a great chance. But again, I'll reiterate, Tennessee did not have a chance at all last year in Tuscaloosa. And if Jarrett Garantano doesn't go rogue at the goal line, all of a sudden we're looking at a 1-touchdown game, 1-score game in the fourth quarter in Bryant-Denny Stadium. So anything is possible in college football, as we have seen year after year after year. And I'm more high on Tennessee's chances of beating Florida because that game is also at home. And while Kyle Trask, I do believe he is the best returning quarterback in the SEC, they have question marks along their offensive line, especially along the interior of their offensive line. And they were able to redshirt some guys last season, but it was still one of the weakest units on their team last season. And they did add Stuart Reese, the grad transfer from Mississippi State, and he can play either guard position, play right tackle, he can play center. But they need more than just one Stuart Reese on their team. So, and on the defensive side of the ball, there are question marks. They lose quite a bit from their front seven. Jabari Zuniga, first-round pick. Adam Schuler, an important defensive tackle for them last year. Luke Ancrum, who was a nice, solid veteran defensive lineman. They are all gone from their defensive line. And then you kind of look at the linebacker position, and Brenton Cox Jr. is hopefully the guy that can replace Jabari Zuniga. He was the transfer from Georgia last offseason, if you remember that news of the linebacker edge rusher, really, that transferred from Georgia to Florida. That was an interesting transfer that made everybody's eyebrows raised, but he is eligible to play after sitting out last season due to transfer rules. Will he be able to have an impact? So there are opportunities for Tennessee in that Florida game, especially with it being at home. But if we're going to point out that the game in Oklahoma isn't as daunting, it's only fair that we also point out that, well, Neyland Stadium may not be the typical Neyland Stadium that we have come to know over the years in that game, just because it's so early in the season. So I like Tennessee's chances more so with the Florida game. But the important thing to me, in my mind, is that this was a 4-year rebuild for Jeremy Pruitt because Butch Jones just left it a complete cluster. He is, quicker than I expected, upgraded Tennessee's chances of beating Georgia, of beating Alabama, of beating Florida, of beating Oklahoma. And to me, that's the most important part.
Yeah, I don't think Tennessee's chances of upsetting Alabama are very high. I know, like you just said, last year Tennessee was surprisingly in that game in the second half, and without Garantano doing what he did, Tennessee would have had a one-score game, and who knows what happens. I'm just not ready to say it's going to happen this year. I don't think it's going to happen this year. I also don't think it's going to happen for Florida this year because I think Florida maybe even better than they were last season. I just don't think that's going to happen for Tennessee to beat Florida this year. I agree with you on that. If Tennessee's going to get an upset this season of the Big Four teams, and who knows, I mean, right now they're the underdogs in all these games, or I think from early lines they are. That could change, obviously, between now and August and September and whenever Tennessee plays these teams. I honestly like Tennessee's chances of those 4 teams. Obviously, Oklahoma the highest. I don't hate Tennessee's chances playing Georgia. I know you're talking about this year. We all thought kind of, hey, it's good that Tennessee's going to be playing Georgia in November and instead of playing them early in the season because that alleviates the gauntlet a little bit that Tennessee tends to have every year at the end of September and all through October. But if there was a year that you'd want to play Georgia kind of early on, it's probably this year specifically. But even in November, I don't know that Georgia is going to have a whole lot figured out, or maybe I don't know. You look at them this past season, and they didn't have a whole lot figured out by the time they got to November. They had a really good defense, and they should still have a really good defense this year. But they do have to replace a few of those guys that were key on the defense last season. And as I mentioned earlier, they have to replace just a ton of players on offense. You have Todd Monken as a new offensive coordinator. I'm not a huge believer in Kirby Smart as a head coach. I think he's an excellent recruiter. I don't think he's to the level of Butch Jones as far as the disconnect between recruiting and coaching ability. But I'm just not sold on his ability as a head coach. I don't think Tennessee pulls off that upset, but I think they have a better chance of beating Oklahoma and Georgia than they do Florida and Alabama. And Ben, if we're sitting here, fast forward to assuming the season starts on time, assuming everything is still in the same time frame, fast forward to the end of November, and if we're sitting there talking about Tennessee as a 9-3 team, assuming they take care of business, against everyone else, and they pull off an upset against an Oklahoma or against a Georgia or maybe a Florida or Alabama. If Tennessee is at least 9-3 at the end of the season and going into a bowl game and have a chance to get a 10th win for the first time since 2007, I don't want to keep too much longer here, but at that point, how high expectations are you going to have for Tennessee's close to the 2021 recruiting class? Because I think at that point, if Tennessee has done that, if they get to a point where they've got 9 wins in the regular season and with a chance to win 10, or if they somehow do win 10 wins in the regular season, which I don't think is going to happen, but if they somehow get there, especially this 21 class that is already pretty talented and has a lot of guys in it that are highly rated, and some other guys are probably going to get bumped before it's all said and done. Tennessee, as I put on our sites this morning on RockyTopInsider.com, Tennessee's still in on a ton of other highly rated prospects. I mean, they have a chance of landing at 5, 6, 7, 8 more guys rated as 4 stars or higher in this class. Obviously, they won't be able to sign everybody that's currently committed and all this stuff. You have guys who decommit, but I'm looking at if Tennessee's at least 9-3, if they're at least 9-3 at the end of this season, and they've beaten a team that they weren't supposed to, and they've taken care of business against all the other teams in their schedule, I'm almost going to guarantee that Tennessee has a top 5 recruiting class in this 21 cycle. I don't see how you couldn't have a top 5 class at that point.
Completely agree, and I already believe that Tennessee will finish with a top 5 class just because of all the work that they have put in so far. But if Tennessee performs that well, then I think you're looking at great chances to land and Armarius Mims. Smile Munden, that may be a different conversation, just because he is supposedly committing in June, and that's next month, obviously, and football season doesn't start until September. So maybe you can get him to flip, but I doubt if he were to commit to Georgia, and I doubt he would flip at that point. But, you're looking at Javari Ritchie's kind of in that same boat as Smile Munden. He's supposed to announce on June 12th. Maybe you can get him to flip, but maybe guys like Jeremiah Williams, Trevally Price, guys that have popped up over the course, like a Hudson Wolf, even though he may do something in the summer. Maybe you can get a Junior Colson to flip. That's a name that, maybe he sees Tennessee have just a lights-out type of season, and he pulls an Eric Gray and decides to flip from Michigan to Tennessee. Maybe. But Armarius Mims and Tony Grimes, the 5-star corner from Virginia Beach, Virginia, and Armarius Mims, the 5-star offensive tackle. I think if Tennessee can go 9-3, including a win over those big four, especially if it's over a Florida, Georgia, or an Alabama, I think Tennessee is in serious discussion to land one of those two. But also, just as important as picking up those commitments, you're looking at solidifying Dylan Brooks and Terrence Lewis, Kamar Wilcoxon, and I don't think Kamar Wilcoxon is going anywhere to begin with, but I'm just naming off like highly rated guys at the top of Tennessee's class that they 1,000% want to hold on to. Not only are you looking at gaining an Armarius Mims or a Tony Grimes, but then at that point you're also looking at potentially just making sure you hold on for Dylan Brooks and Terrence Lewis, which is going to be a battle in and of itself.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. There's been a lot of talk this week about guys making comments and stuff on social media of Tennessee's commits and things like that. A strong season, you're not going to keep everybody in the boat right now because, for one, the numbers aren't going to work out that way. And some guys are just, they're going to leave, whether the coaches tell them to, kind of nudge them in the direction to leave, or whether or not they see another school and say, hey, I think I'd rather go there instead. That's going to happen. But that's a very good point that if Tennessee goes out and has a strong season, you're going to reinforce to these 5 stars and highly rated 4 stars that you have committed right now that, hey, this wasn't all just talk. The improvement we showed at the end of last season wasn't just because the schedule got a little bit easier. We actually are building something. There is progress. We're not just selling you playing time. You actually can come in here and be developed and compete for something of worth worth talking about and worth a substantial title of sorts in your 3-4 years at Tennessee. So we ended up with a little recruiting talk here after all on the podcast, but it all tied back to kind of the season, and we'll have some more stuff hopefully here in the next coming weeks and stuff to talk about on the field, football stuff, some basketball stuff. We may even have a kind of a mailbag podcast edition of answering some questions from you guys if you want to throw some out there for us. But Ben, I appreciate your time. Appreciate you doing the podcast with me for the first time in a while. It's been a lot of recruiting stuff, so I'm happy to have you back on here to do one with you. You can check us out at RockyTopInsider.com, Rocky Top Insider on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. A lot of you listen to the podcast on YouTube, and we really appreciate that. Interact with us on there as well. You can find us both on Twitter. I'm just Nathaniel Rutherford, Mr._Rutherford. He is Ben McKee. He's at Ben McKee14. Check us out and also listen to Ben on the Swain event every single morning from 7 to 10 a.m. on Swain's free app. You can find it there. It's very easy to listen to and download. Does a great job with Swain every single morning on the Swain event. Thank you all for listening, and until next time, this has been another episode of the RTI Podcast.